Fala galera, eu sou o Dinho, sejam bem-vindos ao meu canal e hoje eu vou trazer para vocês os 13 jogos de terror mais bem cotados de 2023. Dê o seu joinha, deixa um likezinho, se inscreve no canal, inscreve a tia, a mãe, a avó, o avô, o inimigo, a inimiga, todo mundo. E se você puder, no cantinho vai ter o QR Code aqui. Puder contribuir com qualquer quantia, vai me ajudar muito a poder estar comprando equipamentos novos e trazendo aí para vocês mais qualidade nos games, tá ok? Então fiquem aí com os 13 jogos de terror de 2023 que já foram lançados e os que ainda serão lançados, os top 13, tá ok? Beleza? Até mais.
Despite the gameplay maybe not being totally horror, you know, it's an asymmetrical multiplayer style game that we've seen adapted to horror franchises in the past, but this one just seems like it's been given an extra level of care. The recreation of the family's house, the fact that you play as both survivors and the family members, either trying to kill the teens or as the teens escape from both the depths of the house, the upper house, and of course the surrounding fields. There just seems to be a level of detail and appreciation for the original film that we haven't really seen in a while. You know, no shade to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies of recent times. I mean, yeah, okay, maybe some shade to them. Still, it seems like they could have a good thing going here, especially if they can make the rest of the gameplay as compelling as playing as Leatherface, because that's the biggest hurdle, right? Everybody wants to play as Leatherface, but sometimes in a multiplayer game, you can't. So if they can make that compelling and interesting, that's going to be a win. The design of the house, all of that stuff lovingly recreated, seems like a good way to get me in, but we have had our eyes on this one for a while now. We're hoping for the best, and it releases this summer. Next, over at number 12, we have the Dead Space remake. Yes, earlier in 2023, it started off with a bang with the Dead Space remake. It did not reinvent the wheel. It did not completely change up the original Dead Space. What it did was give it pretty graphics, more atmosphere, more terror, and smart, clever little change-ups here and there, either in the gameplay, playability, and little tiny additions to the story that just heighten the experience. It makes it essentially the definitive way to play the original Dead Space. It's not a different way, it's just mostly, in our opinion, a better way. It's scary, it's dark, it's gory, and people love it for a reason. There's a reason this thing came out of nowhere, blew people away, and really created a whole franchise, whether you like that or not. The original game is downright incredible. It's action, sci-fi, survival horror at its best from the mid-2000s, and this is a really good representation of it. If you like games like Resident Evil, but you're also into horror movies or weird sci-fi horror movie things like Event Horizon, Dead Space is up your alley. If you haven't considered it by now, you should. Now, next over at number 11, we have the Resident Evil 4 remake. Yeah, we're including the remakes back to back. We're just grouping them together because they're easy picks. The Resident Evil 4 remake is an absolute blast. It's another one that's just a great representation of the original game. Tonally, this one is a little bit different, but it still maintains that good mix of creepy terror and absolute outright zaniness that the original game really kicked off and frankly kind of changed the Resident Evil franchise for better or worse. Still, playing it again in 2023 is awesome. Leon is more badass than ever. He's more playable and more capable than ever. There's a bit more to do in the game world, and it's downright gorgeous. Graphically, sure, but really from an art design and direction standpoint, it's a weird, strange, descent into madness horror trip that is also part like over-the-top Japanese action movie. Like, it's something worth checking out if you never have before. I feel like at this point we're preaching to the choir. I don't know how much more we can say about it, but yeah. Next, over at number 10, we got something special that you may not have heard of. It's called Demonologist. It's on PC, and if you're a fan of specifically Phasmophobia, this is more of like a spooky, realistic, slow-paced, good graphics version of that. Or if you like other games with players, I don't know, even Among Us or prop hunt games, ghost hunt style games, Demonologist is worth checking out. People have absolutely been loving it, and essentially it's up to you and maybe up to 3 other players to cooperatively go around areas and identify what kind of spirit or ghost is in this place, and then you need to exorcise it. You need to perform an exorcism, and you're doing it with old school small tools, very lo-fi tech, crosses, research, you know, doing ghost exorcising the old-fashioned way. You don't need fancy Ghostbusters hardware here. It's all about like the darkness, the pace of it all, and the scares. There's always going to be jump scares. There is a safe house you can take advantage of, but like you still just kind of always feel unsettled. It has voice interaction. It has stuff you'd expect from this style of game, but it's running an Unreal Engine 5, and that just really seems to heighten the experience. You're customizing your characters. There's a good handful of maps, and like I said, people have been really digging it since it released earlier this year. Next, over at number 9, we have the Silent Hill 2 remake. This was announced earlier this year, and it's in the works after many rumors by Bloober Team, the people behind The Medium or Layers of Fear. The Silent Hill 2 remake, as of right now, we haven't seen too much of other than a reveal trailer. We know that they're keeping the story intact from what they say and kind of overhauling the combat a little bit because the combat was rough, but, you know, we're still very curious to see how this shakes out because Silent Hill 2 was such a special, unique game, and we worry whether or not that feel can be replicated in 2023, especially by a different development studio. Still, as much as Konami has had its missteps and it should be criticized, we would still love to see the return of Silent Hill. There are other games in the works in the Silent Hill franchise. Others announced that we can't fit on this list because they're probably not coming this year, but we might see Silent Hill 2 remake this year. Rumors have been suggesting the fall, and that's the perfect time of year to play this type of game, so we hope to see it. Next, over at number 8, we have Killer Clowns from Outer Space, the game. Yeah, we're continuing this trend of bringing weird old horror games into the forefront of video games in a multiplayer fashion, and Killer Clowns makes sense. You know, why not? First of all, the fact that this franchise is getting a game is wild, so we're just gonna roll with it. It's not out yet at the time of making this video, but we're looking forward to it as weird fans of the original. And you know what? Again, even if this game turns out to be not so great, the fact that Killer Clowns is getting some representation in 2023 is kind of a win. You might think we're crazy, but hey, go watch the movie. See for yourself. Next, over at number 7, continuing the multiplayer trend, bear with me, we stumbled across this cool game apparently releasing this year called Carnival Hunt. This is a horror, first-person, asymmetrical multiplayer game with kind of like a social angle to it. Essentially, you're in this haunted, creepy carnival world, and one person is playing as this thing called the Carnival Monster, and the other players are trying to survive as these bunnies. The bunnies, of course, look disgusting and gross, like weird hybrids of Five Nights at Freddy's and, I don't know, Silent Hill. But essentially the bunnies are wind-up dolls, so they have to find keys and wind each other up to keep themselves going, and also try to avoid the spooky, creepy carnival monster at the same time because he can hear you cranking your friends. Sorry. There are a few different carnival monsters that a player can play as that look creepy and cool, and we really hope something comes out of this one, because sometimes a good, simple game like this with a straightforward premise works. I mean, remember the Slender Man games? They weren't perfect, but they had some good, simple scares. So Carnival Hunt, maybe being like a multiplayer spin-off of that, is something we'd like to see. And like we said, the developer, Beer Night Studio, and publisher Crytivo have it slated for 2023. Next, over at number 6, we have Alone in the Dark. This is like a reimagining of the original classic game from the early 90s, with clearly much better graphics, more puzzle solving, more combat, and David Harbour as Edward Carnby. To be honest, this one's still up in the air. We don't know how this one could fare, how it could play, but from what we've seen from the trailers and the gameplay and stuff, it seems like a good, straightforward, third-person survival horror-y type game. The original game was filled with good scares, interesting puzzles, and just a great haunted mansion atmosphere, so we're hoping that Alone in the Dark can really continue that. This brand has needed a revival for a while. Alone in the Dark could absolutely crush in the modern age as another big franchise in the horror world, so we're hoping that they nail it. As of right now, pending any delays, Alone in the Dark is slated for October 25th, 2023. Next, over at number 5, we have Daymare 1994 Sandcastle. This is the follow-up to Daymare 1998, a really underrated game that was kind of like a spiritual successor to classic like Resident Evil 2 style horror. 1994 Sandcastle actually is going to serve as a prequel to that pretty cool game, and it seems like it's going a little crazier, a little bit more action, a little bit more tech, a little bit more gadgets to use, like scanning your environment, using this kind of freezing grip device, and fighting off against crazier, more challenging, deadly, scary enemies. You're playing as a new protagonist this time around, and you're going into like a top secret military research facility that of course is filled with monsters and zombies. I mean, what will we be doing here? There's big action moments, there's survival horror elements, there's environmental puzzles that you'd expect, there's dealing with enemies essentially coming back to life and maybe being more powerful, and a bunch of challenge with multiple difficulty modes. We're hoping they can knock this one out of the park. As of right now, it's releasing August 29th, 2023. Next, over at number 4, we have Stalker 2: Heart of Chernobyl. While this isn't an outright horror game, it's just got some eerie elements to it. If it's anything like the original PC classic Stalker games that kind of birthed a subgenre, there's an unsettling nature to it. It is, of course, a kind of survival game. You're out in a post-apocalyptic nuclear wasteland, and you're fending off against all different types of people, scientific anomalies, abominations, and there's just an air of mystery to it all that if this new game can keep that feel going from the original, you know, we think it earns a worthy spot on this list. It's just a game worth mentioning regardless. It seems like this time around the visuals are really going to heighten the scares because, I mean, look at this game. You see this on screen here. It's been through many delays, a tough development process, but we're really hoping we get to see Stalker 2: Heart of Chernobyl finally this year. Next, over at number 3, we have the Outlast Trials, a game that has not been talked about enough, to be honest. We haven't talked about it enough on this channel, but it seems like it's taking the horror world by storm. It's Amnesia gone multiplayer. Essentially, you and your friends are kind of working through some saw traps, like some jigsaw type traps, to be reductive, but there's a bit more to it than that. Of course, it's all based around Cold War experiments, and you're going to be jumping in alone to these challenges or with friends cooperatively and customizing your own characters and making your way through stuff that still feels typically Outlast. Real creepy, gross freaks, gore, gross out stuff, everything the doctor ordered. As of right now, it's still technically in early access, but it does feel pretty good, and if you haven't checked it out yet, maybe grab a friend or two and try it. Next, over at number 2, Amnesia: The Bunker. The Amnesia developers have really done it again, with really changing things up, but also going back to basics. This is a simple, straightforward game where you're trapped in a war bunker deep below the surface, and you're stuck with nothing but more than a pistol and a lo-fi flashlight that you have to manually wind up. This is an old school game in an old school time period, but it is absolutely genuinely unsettling throughout. We don't want to spoil it or anything like that, but like the original Amnesia before it blew up, it was best to just kind of go in blind and just completely experience this one with a sense of mystery. That's how these games really thrive. The developers, in my opinion, have always crushed it, but The Bunker feels a bit different. It's worth checking it out if you haven't already. For some reason, this one has kind of flown under some people's radar, but in my opinion, the Amnesia experience is still going strong, specifically with Amnesia: The Bunker. I'm back in now. Now down to number 1, we have Alan Wake 2. This is releasing this fall, and we're really excited about it, specifically because not only is it a follow-up to the incredible story and presentation and atmosphere and everything from the original Alan Wake, but this time around the developers Remedy have specified that this game is going full survival horror. And from what we've seen of the game so far, it seems like that. It's very much resource management, scarce ammo, small combat moments, and almost like a Resident Evil remake style over-the-shoulder combat and inventory system that you'd expect, but with lots of scares. Our experience with this game, what we've been able to see behind the scenes, has been pretty spooky and unsettling. It still distinctly feels Alan Wake, because you're still hitting enemies with a flashlight before blasting them with a gun, but the environments, the graphics, the sound design, the atmosphere just really lean in on the horror elements. All of the presentation is downright spooky, and we're excited to experience the full thing. We really hope they nail it with this one. Remedy's had a good track record. We really like their games for a while now, full transparency.
Bom, galera, espero que vocês tenham gostado aí dos 13 jogos. Se vocês gostaram de algum em especial, me avisem aí, tá? O que eu tenho paixão, assim, o que eu ainda não adquiri, mas eu vou adquirir é o Alan Wake 2, que assim, eu vou querer estar trazendo para vocês aí, se der eu trago a série completa aí, tá? Mas deixe nos comentários os jogos se vocês gostaram, o que vocês já jogaram e o que vocês têm vontade de jogar, tá bom? E lembrando mais uma vez, QR Code no cantinho, quem puder ajudar, tá ok? Deixa aí, dê o likezinho, fiquem com Deus, grande abraço, valeu!